Malaysia and Southeast Asia in general has often been noted, including here on this channel, as being a relatively tax-friendly part of the world. But there were some headlines recently that Malaysia was ditching its tax friendliness and going to become tough on taxes for expats. Today, I'm going to set the record straight. So Malaysia's been in the news a lot in the last couple of years, at least in our world. They changed the MM2H visa rules, which allows foreigners to come and live in the country on a 10-year permit. They basically said, hey, if you're going to get this permit, you need to live here for 90 days, and you need to put more money in the bank, and we want you to have a higher income. And so that certainly turned some people away. What they are not turning people away on is if you can meet those requirements, or if you can get some other kind of visa. They're rolling out a new kind of creative visa. You can open up a company there and get a visa and pay a nominal amount of tax. If you can get yourself to Malaysia, the taxes aren't going to be what's stopping you. Let me explain. If it's your first time here, my name is Andrew Henderson. I'm the founder of Nomad Capitalist. We're a boutique consultancy that helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally go where you're treated best. That means reducing your taxes legally. That means diversifying and protecting your assets. It means getting things like multiple second citizenships to make sure that you're always in control of your life and your business. And we also host the biggest and best offshore conference called Nomad Capitalist Live, which is open to everybody. So what Malaysia had for many years and still has is what's called a territorial tax system. Now, I think people often misunderstand territorial tax systems, and this is not tax advice, and it's not possible really to talk about all territorial tax systems the same, because both the actual letter of the law and the actual application of it differs from multiple countries. Some countries will say, hey, if you're coming here and you are like working for a company and you're living here full time, or you're working for your own company, that could be how it works, that's not territorial. Other countries are like, well, it just really depends on where the money's going. The mistake people often make is, well, I'm not bringing the money into Malaysia, or I'm not bringing the money into the United States. Remittance isn't necessarily the issue. The issue may be where the work is being done, what's classified as work being done, where the corporate structure is, where the clients are. Any of those things and more could dictate the territory where the money's being earned. Generally speaking, I think that in Southeast Asia, there is some level of flexibility. You need to structure your affairs properly, but you can live in countries like Malaysia, like Thailand, like Singapore, and like the Philippines, and you can earn money overseas and that money won't be taxed. So it's not an issue of citizenship. The US taxes you no matter where you live, and obviously there's ways to greatly reduce that. Everybody else, you're taxed on largely on residential, so if you're European, you're taxed on where you live. In Malaysia, you can live there full time, and if all your money comes from an investment somewhere else, you generally wouldn't pay tax. And so if you find somewhere else to run a business or make an investment where that money isn't taxed or is taxed very lightly, then you'd have no tax in Malaysia, you'd have no or very low amounts of tax in the other jurisdiction. Net effect is you have a zero or very low tax rate. And so you can do that. It's a much more flexible system than, again, Europe's residential system or the US's citizenship-based system. And so what happened was, in 2021, Malaysia did two things that I saw in tax. They said, number one, are we going to have a wealth tax come back? No, that seems like a stupid idea. Score one for Malaysia, because not a lot of countries were saying no to wealth tax back then. I think it was Uruguay and Malaysia and maybe one or two others. A lot of other countries were and still are flirting with it. So that was positive. The other thing that was widely discussed, and that I think was relatively close, was, hey, let's get rid of this idea of territorial tax and let's basically tax foreign source income. But my understanding from everything that we looked at was you were essentially going to have, and everyone uses different terminology, right? And so sometimes people even use the same terminology for different things. But the idea, from what my understanding was, you were going to have a true remittance-based system. You do have countries like Ireland, like Malta, like a few others in Europe, where it is based on, okay, you made money somewhere else, you pay on what you bring into the country. So it's a little bit more aggressive in terms of taxing you, whereas like a true territorial system that's really flexible would say, hey, you make the money overseas, like we don't really care what you do with it, right? And you know, like Thailand, for example, is pretty strict on remittances, and like if the money's earned in that year. Malaysia really didn't have some of those laws. And so it was kind of like, hey, you make the money overseas, and like wherever it goes, it goes. What the system, again, like look at a system like in Ireland, for example. You make money in another jurisdiction, but then whatever you bring in to live, whatever you spend in the country, whatever you bring in to invest, we're going to tax that. And so it's unclear to me exactly at what rate. I presume it would have just been normal income tax rates, which are not super low and they're not super high in Malaysia. And so the idea for someone who is an expat who would be living in Malaysia on some kind of permit, I mean, on the MM2H, you really aren't allowed to work. But if you have some kind of permit, the idea would be, hey, let's say you make $1 million in your UAE company. You could then basically make a change, whereas in Malaysia before, you'd be like, all right, whenever I want to send money to Malaysia, I'll just send it to my Malaysian bank account, which I have because I'm a resident. Then you could just spend that money locally. Or what I'll do a lot of times, since I still have, I have foreign bank accounts, foreign credit cards, I will really not even use my Malaysian bank account other than to pay local bills, so I'll just spend that money. And so what Malaysia was threatening to do was saying, hey, if you bring the money in after a certain date, we're going to start taxing that as income. And theoretically, I don't think the application would actually come in play here. Like if you charged something on a U.S. American Express card, for example, or you use your Bank of Georgia card, theoretically that would count as remittance. I know in Europe it does. Even in some European countries, I mean, the application probably isn't entirely there, but I don't know that Malaysia would really be tracking like what are you buying at the Prada store with your American Express card. But technically that would be remittance and you should report it. And so the system that was being proposed was not that they were going to totally eliminate tax and say, hey, that whole $1 million you're earning in your UAE company is now going to be deemed taxable in Malaysia. It's going to be, hey, whatever you basically are bringing in. And so that's now been delayed until 2026 or possibly even 2027. And so the idea that this is going to be a place where you were just going to have to pay like through the nose to live there, obviously that would make it far less attractive. Some of the things that Malaysia was doing into the pandemic, I think they're kind of walking back and saying, hey, we want people to come here because Malaysia still is one of the most open countries in the world. It's a multicultural country. They really like people coming from all over and investing, and they just, I think, like people from around the world. I have not seen that change. I've heard a few people in the media like, oh, it's not the same anymore. To me, it's the same. I went back to Malaysia this year. People are just as nice. Everybody's just as welcoming. The government officials are, by global standards, still some of the nicest in the world. I don't see something where they're throwing the book at you because you're a foreigner. I just don't. And so I think Malaysia is going to go back to being more open. And I think that the idea was never to say, hey, that $1 million you're earning in the UAE, pay us 25% of it, for example. The idea was, okay, pay us 25% of the 100 grand you live on here. And so obviously then the issue is what's your disparity in terms of your cost of living in Malaysia, which for someone like myself, I don't even spend all my time in Malaysia. And so therefore what it costs me to live in Malaysia is relatively negligible compared to the amount of money that I'm earning. And so I would still have a very, very low single-digit tax rate. The other issue was that Malaysia has, unlike a lot of Western countries, to the best of my understanding, a very strict kind of days test where we often say, hey, the 183-day rule. If you spend 183 days in a country, you're a tax resident. That generally still is the same. Some countries it's 180, 182. I think it's actually 183 in Malaysia, but it could be off by a day or two. Other countries, like in Europe, will often say, well, wait a second. Okay, you weren't here for 183, but you have a car and your mistress lives here, so like, that's good enough for us. Prove us that you shouldn't pay tax. Malaysia is a lot more straightforward. Like, did you spend the time or not? We're not looking at like your friends. We're not looking at your Instagram account. We're just like, okay, did you spend the time or not? And so if you are living, for example, our trifecta lifestyle, you could spend 4 months in Malaysia and then spend 4 months somewhere else and then 4 months somewhere else, and you wouldn't even trigger any of this and have to worry about it at all. And so the bottom line of Malaysia's tax change is Malaysia continues to have a very friendly tax regime. I think that it'll continue to be a friendly country. The proposed change wasn't nearly as bad as people thought. It was basically just kind of, in my mind, a semantic issue where they used the same terminology that other countries doing more aggressive stuff would do, even though the average person that we're talking to would have seen a negligible tax change. No doubt would have been a change, would have been a filing requirement. That said, even if you're not living there full time, it probably wouldn't have been an issue at all. So by and large, as Asia starts to reopen, Southeast Asia remains a tax-friendly place. Malaysia remains a place that I enjoy spending time, and I think it's going to be just fine, at least for a number of years.